Hello, my History 461 students. This is Professor Donald Earl Collins again talking to you about the course. We have about a week and a half, nearly 2 weeks, not quite, about 12 days left in this course. So I want to talk to you a little bit about week 7 and 8, my expectations, summary of things that we're going to cover, and hopefully that you'll be reading, and sort of really just trying to sum the course up in terms of what's been going on in our own lifetimes regarding African American history, the meaning of things, the things that we shouldn't really even have answers to quite yet. So, um, just a few things in terms of thinking about the course in general. Some of you have been a little resistant to taking in new ideas around African American history. It's as if you're taking the course with your preconceived notion that because you've lived 30 years or 40 years or even 60 years, that somehow you know everything there is to know about black history and therefore no one else can tell you any different. Unfortunately, that even for people who've lived their whole lives and dealt with racism and other issues, you don't know everything. You don't know certain facts, you don't know how to interpret certain facts, and you're students anyway. The whole purpose of this course is really to come out of the course with a better understanding of different ways of looking at African American history than you would have had if you hadn't taken the course. That's all. No one's saying except my interpretation of black history or Henry Louis Gates' interpretation of black history, or Patricia J. Williams's interpretation of Du Bois's or Booker T. Washington's. Just know that. Just know those versions. Just have an understanding of those versions so that you can not just talk about, well, when I grew up at such and such a place at such and such time, this is what happened. Great. I didn't know you represented 44 million people by yourself. I didn't know that your entire experience was representative of all of those people. So I just want to get that out of the way first, that for those of you who have put up a bit of a fight with me over the last 4, 5, or 6 weeks in this course, I don't know why you're fighting me. Be honest with you, I'm just trying to teach a course and make sure that you have all those different ways of thinking about black history and all those facts in your disposal so that you don't dispose of them but use them and really thinking through how those things fit or may not fit your own experiences at the very least. Some of you are apologizing for racism. Some of you are saying that the entire black experience is basically one of blacks being victims of racism. And so that's where this is coming from, especially in light of what we're covering this week and next week, which is basically the black history that is within our own lifetimes, the history of African Americans since roughly 1968 or 1972, and which in my case is pretty much my entire lifetime since I'm not quite 50. Anyway, and so when you think about things like larger American stories around deindustrialization, suburbanization, gentrification, the outsourcing of jobs, the growth of economic inequality between America's top 10% or 1% or 25% and the rest of the country. All of those things have an adverse effect on African Americans more so because African Americans find themselves at the bottom of every category just about in American society due to long-term systemic racism, long-term structural racism, long-term institutional racism. And so even if you were to solve the problem of the hearts and minds and be able to reach those who hate African Americans and hate other people of color, even if you somehow made them all sympathetic and all of a sudden they were all, oh, we love you kind of people when it comes to people of color, it wouldn't change those trends simply because of the fact that those are already baked into the structures and systems that make up American society as a whole. So, of course, all of these things would have an adverse effect on African Americans. So, when factories shut down, African Americans tend to lose their jobs. Why? Because their education level tends to be less than whites, their income level tends to be less than whites, and so losing a job has a more adverse effect on blacks and black communities than on whites and predominantly white communities. It's literally that simple. It's not about hard work. It's not about putting forth larger effort. It's not even necessarily about getting more education, although those things do help. It's the reality that because of the larger structures in our society, um, African Americans in particular are adversely affected when things, larger trends in our society, turn negative. Economic inequality, loss of jobs, outsourcing, recessions like the 1981 to 83 recession that put millions of people out of work, high interest rates. When interest rates hit 22.5%, if whites can't buy houses, blacks definitely can't buy houses. If whites can't buy cars, blacks definitely can't buy cars, those kinds of things. Or with regard to thinking about week 8, the Great Recession of 2008 to the present, really. Um, and the fact that people who, when they are becoming employed, are taking jobs that pay way less than the previous job that they may have had before the Great Recession started. So if you were making $60,000 a year working on Wall Street in 2008 and you lost your job and had to go back to school and whatnot and find another job, and your next job happens to be at Costco paying $22 an hour, you might be making $35,000 a year. You might be making $30,000 a year, but it's still way less than what you've been making before. So, and if you're black and going through those things, because of all the other structures that happen to be stacked against African Americans, generally speaking, you will make less money too, and probably a lot less. So there's more homelessness, there's more white collar crime as a result. All of those things tend to add up as a result of the larger trends in American society. And that's what we're really looking at. Those larger trends within an ideological context that says that African Americans have gotten too much from the federal government in terms of civil rights, that blacks are already equal, why aren't they advancing more? Well, it's not because they're not equal, it's because of reverse racism. They have racism toward themselves, or they think they're using whites as an excuse, or they're playing the race card, or because African Americans are intellectually inferior, or because they're depending on the government for handouts. There's this culture of poverty, or because of black crime, and all the other things that white conservatives and some black conservatives say, generally speaking, to describe 44 million people in 2017, or 30 million people back in the 1990s, or 25 million people back in the 1970s. That has been the trend with regard to African American history within our own lifetimes. And so my point to you is, in looking at week 7 and looking at week 8, to get beyond just these trends, to get beyond just what white people say about blacks, what white conservatives say about blacks, what evangelicals say about blacks, and really look hard at what African Americans have been able to do in terms of leadership, in terms of politics, in terms of policy, in terms of trends that African Americans themselves are responsible for. Like, for instance, black migration into cities. By the 1970s, more than half of all African Americans lived in cities. By 2010, basically 90% of us live in cities. It's kind of an interesting trend. We are outtrending whites in terms of that. That since the 1990s, there's actually been sort of a reverse black migration, in which particularly younger professionals and paraprofessionals, white-collar workers and near-white-collar workers, have left the industrial cities and the Rust Belt cities of places like Pittsburgh and Detroit and Chicago and, of course, New York and Philadelphia, and have moved back south, but not south to live on a farm, but south to live in places like Atlanta and Dallas and Houston and New Orleans and maybe even some Sunbelt cities like Phoenix and Denver and places of that nature. But that's been part of the trend too. Or if we've moved to black enclaves within larger cities like Washington, D.C. and Prince George's County, for instance, or Gwinnett County outside Atlanta is another example. And there are other examples like that as well. And these tend to be upwardly mobile African Americans, who, by the way, despite all claims to the contrary, make up roughly 1 out of every 3 African Americans living in this country. They might not be upper middle class, but they are somewhere between lower middle class and solidly middle class. And that is basically 1/3 of the African American population. There's about another 10 to 20% of the population that's upper middle class, affluent, maybe even in the category of wealthy, right? That's another percentage of the population. So say 20, 25%, that pushes it up to somewhere near 60% of the African American population being either lower middle class, solidly middle class, affluent, somewhat wealthy, actually fairly well off to well off. That's most African Americans. However, roughly 40% of African Americans find themselves either struggling as the working poor, lower middle class to working poor, or just welfare poor and abject poverty. And that's roughly 40% of all African Americans living in the United States. So as a group, we are disproportionately poor, but we're not 90% poor. This is an improvement on where we've been, but shows us still how far we have to go to even approximate poverty, the poverty levels among whites, which happen to be, the level of poverty among whites is like 15%, for example. However, this is where the interesting thing around using statistics as a weapon against African Americans comes in. Most people in this country, just in sheer numbers, are white. Most poor people in this country are white. Most people in this country are white. If 63% of the population is white, if you think about whites being, say 15% of that percentage being poor, 15% of 200 million people is roughly 30 million people. There are only 44 million African Americans in the United States. We can't possibly be most poor people in the United States, even if you counted all of us, right? So, statistically speaking, forget about disproportionate, because that's what newspapers tend to use, that's what historians and other scholars tend to use. In sheer numbers, most poor people are white. Yet the argument about poverty is always around race from a white perspective and how blacks need to do more in order to climb out of poverty, rather than the structures that keep people in poverty and keep people from being socially mobile and upwardly mobile in terms of education, in terms of being able to have the means necessary to dig their way out of poverty, and the opportunities to dig themselves out of poverty through work, through education, through other means. And so when you start thinking about the period since 1968, that's what African Americans in leadership positions in politics, whether they're mayors or in some cases governors, or certainly in one case President of the United States and Barack Obama, tends to run up against when you're dealing with all these issues, whether it's the war on drugs, whether it's dealing with education and affirmative action, whether it's dealing with public housing or just decent living housing or living wage. These are the issues that African Americans in leadership tend to run up against. A culture so determined to say that the reason why African Americans find themselves in the position they're in is because of their own doing, and not because of structures in place that have basically, for a better way of putting it, no better way of putting it, oppressed African Americans in systemic and structural and in institutional ways, then it's kind of hard to even begin a conversation that deals with issues around race, around racism. If one side overwhelmingly sees you as being unworthy of help and opportunity, and you're having to constantly fight that war, while simultaneously leadership that's caught between these two sides intends to do things to placate a side that basically would prefer you to be quiet and stay oppressed and not protest and not complain, not write articles that counter arguments that basically say that blacks live in a culture of pathology, for instance. So a lot of what is in your readings for week 7 and for weeks 8 are dealing with really entrenched contemporary and contemporaneous issues that African American scholars and African American historians, generally speaking, don't have answers to. This is the article that I wanted you to read for the paper that was due week 5 that is still available for you to read if you go back to your email from August 21st and actually open it up. The idea that we as African American historians have been overly optimistic to the point of being Pollyannish about the state of things with regard to the black experience in the United States. This sort of idea that things will inevitably become better over time for African Americans, and therefore, as blacks, that we can suspect that one day, some shiny day, we will be equal, that we will be one with whites in a society that is equitable in terms of its economics and politics, in terms of our outlook socially and culturally, in terms of the way we treat others around the world. This is a ridiculous notion, not just in my opinion, but based on my expertise as an African American historian, based on the evidence of the past 400 years. That doesn't mean that you stop resisting, that you don't try, that you don't work, that you don't go to school, that you don't earn degrees, that you don't try to make life better for your kids, make sure that they have a better life than you did. It doesn't mean any of that. It just means that having this one day everything will be great, we'll live in some sort of racial utopia kind of thing is extremely unrealistic, and quite frankly it's kind of hurtful. If you have this sort of vision, you're going to find yourself forever disillusioned and forever angry and forever resentful about the fact that you realize at the back of your head this probably isn't going to happen in our lifetime, in my lifetime, maybe in our kids' lifetime, maybe not in our grandkids' lifetime, maybe never, right? And so these are the things that we have to grapple with as history students, or in my case, in the other cases of people who have devoted our careers and our writings to being historians. These are the things that we grapple with as historians. There are some things that we don't know the answer to. We can't know the answer to because we're not clairvoyant. We're not, seers. We're not the kind of people who can literally predict the future, right? Most of us would have never predicted that Barack Obama could become president. And nor could any of us predict that despite the fact that we've had our first black president, that black president would just as much represent the elements, institutional white supremacy and structural white supremacy or racism, as he did hope that we could overcome these things, right? So these are the kinds of things you want to think about, want to maybe bring up in discussion, especially for week 8. Certainly the kinds of things that you might want to keep in the back of your head as you go through the readings and go through the 70s, 80s, 90s, the zeros, and the tens, getting us all the way to the present state of the black experience in the U.S.